No one noticed when Caleb Turner left the house, except the dog. It was just past midnight when the front door creaked open, the sound swallowed by the wind pushing down from the hills. The trailer park on the edge of town sat quiet under a pale moon, the kind of quiet that made every small noise feel louder than it should. Caleb slipped outside with an old backpack slung over one shoulder. Inside it, a threadbare blanket, 2 cans of soup, and a pocket knife his grandfather once gave him. That was it. Behind him padded Rusty, a skinny brown mutt with one torn ear and eyes that always seemed to ask questions. Rusty didn't bark. He never did when it mattered. Caleb was 16, too young to be on his own, too tired to stay. The argument had started over nothing. Dirty dishes, unpaid bills, a look that lasted half a second too long. His stepfather's voice rose fast, sharp and familiar, cutting through the thin trailer walls. "You don't do anything right. You think life owes you something?" Caleb stood there, jaw clenched, hands shaking, feeling small in a place that had never felt like home. So he left. The road out of town was empty, a ribbon of cracked asphalt disappearing into dark pine trees. Cold crept through his sneakers with every step. Autumn had already lost its warmth, and winter was circling like a patient animal. Caleb pulled his hoodie tighter and kept walking, Rusty close at his heel. He didn't have a plan, just a direction. An hour later, he reached the old quarry road, a dirt path locals avoided since the mine shut down years ago. Half hidden by brush stood a collapsing shed, its roof sagging like tired shoulders. Someone had once stored tools there. Now it held only silence and the smell of damp wood. Caleb pushed the door open. It groaned in protest. Inside, moonlight leaked through broken boards, striping the dusty floor in silver lines. Rusty circled twice before sitting down, tail thumping once against the dirt. Caleb dropped his backpack and sank beside him. For the first time that night, he let himself breathe. Fear crept in slow. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady and cold. How long could he last out here? A night? A week? He imagined the first snow, imagined frozen mornings and empty cans, imagined people shaking their heads when they talked about him. That kid won't make it. Caleb stared at the dark ceiling. He remembered his grandfather's voice from years ago, back when the world still felt solid. Stone holds heat. Fire just borrows it. At the time, it sounded like an old man's rambling. Tonight, it felt like a clue. He ran his hand over the cold dirt floor, then looked at the piles of rock near the quarry wall. Heavy, solid, patient. The kind of things that didn't give up easily. Rusty leaned against him, warm and real. "Guess it's you and me," Caleb whispered. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the trees. Somewhere far off, a train horn sounded like a warning, or a promise. Caleb didn't know yet that this broken shed would become his shelter. He didn't know people would laugh when they saw what he tried to build. All he knew was this: he wasn't going back, and winter was coming. Morning came in thin gray light, slipping through the cracked boards of the shed. Caleb woke with a stiff back and numb fingers. Rusty was already up, nose pressed to the door, tail twitching like he was checking the weather for them. Cold air rushed in when Caleb stepped outside. Frost dusted the weeds around the quarry, and the rocks near the wall looked like they'd been dipped in silver. His breath showed with every exhale. Winter wasn't just coming anymore. It was already knocking. Caleb spent the first day doing what he knew how to do, patching holes with scrap wood, dragging a warped pallet across the doorway to block the wind, and stacking old tarps along the north wall. By afternoon, his hands were raw and his stomach growled. That was when he noticed the stones. They were everywhere, piled along the quarry wall, scattered across the ground like leftovers from some forgotten job. Big ones, smooth ones, heavy ones that felt permanent in a world that wasn't. He remembered his grandfather again. Stone holds heat, fire just borrows it. Caleb crouched and pressed his palm to one rock. Cold now, but what if it didn't have to be? By the next morning, he had a plan that barely made sense even to him. He dragged stones inside and stacked them along one side of the shed. Then more. Then more. He dug a shallow trench in the dirt floor and laid smaller rocks into it, packing them tight like puzzle pieces. From the scrapyard near town, he hauled back a bent metal pipe someone had tossed out years ago. When he lit his tiny fire, he ran the pipe through the rock pile instead of straight out the roof. Smoke curled wrong at first. He coughed. Rusty sneezed. Caleb adjusted the angle, scraped out the ash, tried again. The fire burned low and steady, and the stones slowly warmed under his hands. That afternoon, two guys from town spotted him while driving past the quarry road. They stopped to watch. "What are you doing, kid?" one called out, leaning on his truck door. "Trying not to freeze," Caleb said. They laughed. Not mean exactly, but not kind either. "You can't heat rocks and expect to live out here," the other one said. "You need firewood, real heat." Caleb didn't argue. He kept stacking stones. Word traveled fast in a small town. By the third day, people were talking. The runaway kid, the dog, the crazy rock heater. Someone at the gas station said he'd be gone before the first real storm. Someone else said he wouldn't make it to Thanksgiving. Caleb heard it all when he walked into town for cheap bread and a bag of rice. He kept his head down, cheeks burning, heart tight. Back at the shed, he worked harder. He widened the stone bed under the floor. He packed dirt between the gaps so heat couldn't escape too fast. He routed the pipe in a crooked path through the rocks so the warmth had to stay longer before leaving. At night, he burned a small fire for hours, then let it die and waited. The air inside stayed warm longer than it should have. Not hot, not cozy, but survivable. Rusty slept closer to the stone wall now. Caleb noticed that first. Outside, the sky turned the color of steel. Wind swept down from the hills and bent the trees. The weather radio someone had left behind crackled with warnings about a heavy storm moving in. Caleb stood in the doorway of the shed, looking at the clouds. They thought he was stupid. They thought he was desperate. Maybe he was both. But he was also building something with his own hands. Something that might keep him and Rusty alive. And if winter wanted to test him, he was finally ready to answer. The storm arrived the way trouble usually did in that town. Quiet at first, then all at once. By late afternoon, the sky had turned the color of dirty cotton, and the wind started pushing sideways through the trees. Caleb stood outside the shed, with his hands in his pockets, watching the quarry disappear behind drifting snow. Rusty whined once and pressed against his leg. The weather radio crackled inside the shed. Winter storm warning. Temperatures expected to drop below zero overnight. Caleb swallowed. This was the night everyone said he wouldn't make it. He fed the fire slowly, careful not to waste what little wood he had left. The flames licked through the bent pipe and vanished into the stones. He touched the rock wall with his palm. It was warm now, deep warm. Not the sharp heat of fire, but something steady and patient. When the sun went down, the world outside vanished. Snow slammed into the shed like handfuls of gravel. Wind shoved at the walls, making the boards creak and groan. The old structure felt like it might fold in on itself if the storm leaned any harder. Caleb sat on his blanket with Rusty curled against his ribs. For hours he kept the fire going, letting the rocks drink in the heat. His eyelids grew heavy, but fear kept him awake. Finally, near midnight, he did the thing no one else in town would dare do. He let the fire die. The flames shrank to red coals, then gray ash, then nothing. Silence followed. No crackle, no pop. Just wind screaming outside like something alive. Caleb waited. The cold didn't rush in like he expected. It crept instead, slow and unsure. The air cooled a little, but the floor stayed warm. Heat rose gently from the stones beneath him, seeping into the space like breath from a sleeping animal. Rusty didn't shiver. That's when Caleb believed it might work. By morning, the storm had buried the quarry road. Snow stacked halfway up the shed walls. The door was frozen shut until Caleb kicked it loose. Cold punched him in the face when he stepped outside. Inside the shed, it was still livable. Not comfortable, not safe by normal standards, but warm enough that the water in his bottle hadn't frozen. Warm enough that Rusty wagged his tail instead of tucking it. Across town, lights flickered in windows all night long as people fed their stoves. Smoke poured from chimneys like surrender flags. Men woke every hour to keep fires alive. Some families burned through a week's worth of wood in one night. They assumed Caleb was gone. Two guys from the gas station even drove past the quarry road that morning, slowing to look. One of them shook his head. "Told you he wouldn't last," he said. But inside the shed, Caleb was sitting on his blanket, hands wrapped around a tin cup of hot soup. He hadn't slept much, but he was still here. That afternoon, the storm got worse. Wind howled so hard it pushed snow through the cracks in the boards. Caleb lit a small fire again, not to survive, but to recharge the stones. The pipe glowed dull red for a while, then faded as the heat sank into the rock. Night came early. The second night was colder than the first. The kind of cold that made wood snap and metal cry out. Caleb lay awake listening to the storm batter the walls. Fear returned, quiet but heavy. What if the stones cooled too fast? What if this was just luck? Rusty lifted his head and licked Caleb's cheek. Caleb smiled despite himself. Still here, buddy, he whispered. Outside, the storm owned the land. Inside, a boy and his dog held on to warmth that wasn't supposed to exist. And somewhere in town, people were about to realize they had been wrong. The storm finally loosened its grip on the fourth morning. Not gently, just enough to let people move again. Snowdrifts swallowed fences and parked cars. The road into town looked like a white river, cut only by tire tracks and boot prints. Most folks stepped outside to check on neighbors, to see who needed help, who had run out of wood, who had made it through the night. That's when someone remembered the boy at the quarry. Anyone check on that kid? A woman asked at the diner. Two men volunteered. One was Tom Reeves, who ran the gas station. The other was Mark Delaney, who lived near the quarry road. They loaded a sack of firewood and a thermos of coffee into the back of Mark's truck and drove out through the snow. Neither of them expected good news. The shed came into view like a half-buried secret, its roof barely visible under a thick layer of snow. No smoke rose from it. No footprints led away. Tom exhaled slowly. I told you this was a bad idea. Mark climbed out first and trudged to the door. He knocked once, hard. Nothing. He knocked again. Then the door opened. Warm air spilled out like a breath from summer. Caleb stood there in a sweater and worn jeans, hair sticking up in every direction. Rusty pushed past his legs, tail wagging like they were long-lost friends. Both men froze. You okay? Tom asked. Caleb blinked. Yeah, why? Mark stepped inside, stamping snow off his boots. His shoulders relaxed the second he crossed the threshold. The shed wasn't cozy, but it wasn't freezing either. The floor felt warm through his soles. Tom followed, staring at the stone wall along one side. Where's your fire? Went out last night, Caleb said. Didn't need it. He lifted one loose board from the floor and showed them the rocks beneath, dark and warm to the touch. He explained how the pipe ran through them, how the heat stayed longer than the fire did. Neither man laughed. They crouched there like kids, pressing their hands to the stones. Son, Tom said slowly, you heated your place with rocks? Caleb shrugged. Guess so. Word didn't wait long to spread. By afternoon, 3 more trucks had pulled up along the quarry road. People stood outside the shed, peering in like it was some kind of miracle they could measure with their boots and breath. This kid didn't burn half the wood we did, someone said. My pipes froze last night, another muttered. His didn't. Caleb felt their eyes on him. Different now, not dismissive, curious, careful. That evening, someone brought him a bag of groceries. Someone else left an old wool coat. A woman handed Rusty a strip of jerky and scratched behind his ears. You got a place to stay warm now, she said. That matters. Later, when the visitors were gone, Caleb sat on the edge of the blanket, staring at the stone wall. The shed felt smaller with people gone, but quieter too. He hadn't planned for any of this. He just didn't want to freeze. Rusty lay beside him, belly up, snoring softly. For the first time since he left home, Caleb didn't feel invisible, didn't feel stupid, didn't feel like he was waiting to fail. Outside, smoke still rose from chimneys in town, but now some of that smoke came with questions. And in a place where winter decided who stayed and who disappeared, a boy and his dog had just rewritten the rules. The next weeks changed the town in quiet ways. It started with small things. A man brought Caleb a stack of old bricks and asked if the rocks could work under his kitchen floor. A woman whose pipes had frozen twice that winter wanted to know if the stone bed could keep her house from going cold at night. Caleb showed them what he knew, how the pipe had to twist through the rocks, how the gaps had to be packed tight, how the fire didn't need to roar to do its job. He never called it an invention, he just called it survival. Soon, smoke rose from fewer chimneys. People burned less wood. Nights grew calmer. Fewer men stayed awake feeding stoves until their eyes burned and their hands cracked from cold. Winter was still winter, but it didn't feel like a sentence anymore. One afternoon, as snow fell in slow, heavy flakes, a familiar truck stopped at the quarry road. Caleb recognized it right away. His stepfather stepped out, shoulders hunched against the wind. He didn't yell. He didn't lecture. He just stood there for a moment, looking at the shed that had turned into something solid and warm. I heard you were living out here, he said. Caleb crossed his arms, unsure what to feel. Rusty stayed close to his leg. You don't look like you're freezing, the man added. I'm not, Caleb said. They stood in silence, breath turning white between them. I was wrong about you, his stepfather said finally. You built something. That counts. It wasn't an apology, but it was close enough to matter. After he left, Caleb sat on the stone floor and felt the heat rise through his jeans. He thought about how he'd come out here expecting to disappear, how he'd believed he was too young, too broke, too unwanted to make it on his own. And yet here he was, not because he was stronger than Winter, but because he thought differently about it. Rusty barked when neighbors came by now, not to warn them off, but to greet them. Kids from town brought him scraps. Adults brought questions. Some brought gratitude. Caleb learned something that Winter no one had taught him in school. You don't have to be loud to matter. You don't have to be older to change things. Sometimes all it takes is one stubborn idea and the courage to try it when everyone says it won't work. The shed by the quarry was still rough. The roof still leaked. The walls still creaked in the wind. But inside it held something new. Proof that running away didn't always mean giving up. Sometimes it meant starting over somewhere no one expected you to survive. And maybe that was the real warmth. Not the stones, not the fire, but the feeling of finally being enough. So let me ask you something. If you were in Caleb's place, would you have tried to build something? Or would you have turned back? Do you think one idea can really change how people survive? Stories like this remind us that hope doesn't always look heroic. Sometimes it looks like a teenage boy, a stray dog, and a pile of cold rocks in a broken shed. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think differently about what's possible, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more true-style survival stories, human resilience, and moments that prove even the smallest choices can change a life. Because the next story might change the way you see the world.